Hello everyone, and thank you for joining the second annual Signal Center's Accessibility Awareness Series. Signal Centers is located in Chattanooga, Tennessee, a gig city on the Tennessee River, and ranked as one of 2019's top 100 places to live in America. Signal Centers provides technology, accommodations, and training to help individuals with disabilities live their best lives. Here is CEO Donna McConico.
Hi, I'm Donna McConico. Welcome to the Signal Center's Accessibility Awareness Summit. Last year, at our very first summit, our keynote speaker, Haben Girma, said this: "The problem is never the disability." She was right. We are living in the midst of a technology renaissance, and we must be the leaders insisting that this movement is for all. Accessibility is within our reach, and it will take persistence and creativity to fully embrace all of the possibilities that technology offers for individuals with disabilities. Thank you for joining us again this year to continue the conversation about accessibility.
This webinar series would not be possible without the support of our partner and host, Chattanooga State Community College. With an enrollment of more than 8,000 students, Chattanooga State offers more than 100 degree plans. Its digital accessibility mission statement is a commitment to provide all individuals the opportunity to use technologies. Here is Vice President of Academic Affairs, Dr. Beth Norton.
Chattanooga State hopes this conference series will inspire transformative conversations about the inclusion of all individuals in the ever-changing world of digital technology.
Signal Centers is grateful to the following sponsors: McKee Bakery, Blue Cross Blue Shield of Tennessee, Phil Hour, Electric Power Board, Tennessee Council on Developmental Disabilities, AT&T, and a special thank you to Unum for sponsoring today's presentations.
At Unum, we're committed to becoming the most inclusive, diverse, and welcoming company in our industry and beyond, which is why we're proud to support Signal Centers in their work to increase awareness of accessibility and inclusion in the workplace and community.
And now, in recognition of Global Accessibility Awareness Day, Signal Centers welcomes our keynote speaker and maker of awesomeness, Jared Spool, co-CEO of Center, with Moving from Disability Accommodations to Universal Design.
Today, I want to talk about how we currently have an average problem. And when I say that, I don't mean that the problem we have is like other problems. What I mean is we have a problem with averages. We keep trying to use averages as our goal, as our destination. Now, to understand why there's a problem, we sort of have to understand the history of averages. The idea of the modern average was really pioneered by a Belgian mathematician and astronomer named Adolphe Quetelet. And he got fascinated because astronomers were using averages to figure out the movement of stars through the sky, and they didn't have very precise equipment, so they would literally etch a line in a telescope as a star went by, and then after a period of time etch another line. Because they didn't have precise equipment, Quetelet figured out that if you could take a bunch of different observations and sum them up and then divide them by the number of observations, you got a pretty good estimate for what was there. And he began to be really interested in how to use averages for lots of different things. And what he quickly found was that it was a really powerful tool to measure all sorts of things. And he started to look at people and people's behaviors, and he started to think about an average person and what's an average person like, and not just height and width and weight, but all sorts of factors. And the process of understanding averages became one of of really trying to hone into this notion of sort of a perfect person. And the churches got into this too, and they started to look at, what is the ideal person that God intended. And so we honed in on this. And it got a lot of play in the mid 1800s, so much so that it got to the attention of President Lincoln, who was dealing with a different problem at the time, which was he was trying to keep the Union Army effective. And he hired a team, including Kettlett, to come in. And Kettlett decided that the big problem was that they were custom making everything. They were custom making weapons, and they were custom making uniforms and all these different things. And so decided to try and mass produce these things for the Army to get them right, and came up with what the notion of what the average dimensions of a soldier should be so that they could produce a uniform, so they could produce weapons, the average intake for food so they could produce rations. And this idea of basing everything off of averages was this idea that there was this center point, this key place that everything was trying to get to, that every one of us was trying to hone in on. And that caught on, and that became the way we thought about how we interact with people and how we create things and design things for a long time. When the first military plane showed up in the 1920s, the cockpits that were designed were created based on the measurements, these sort of notions of an average pilot, and so they put the cockpits together. But in the 1950s, after the Air Force split off from the rest of the armed forces, they were trying to train up pilots in large quantities to prepare them for the Korean War. And as they were training pilots, they were having a problem. A lot of these pilots were dying in training. And at first they were blaming the pilots for not being good enough, and then they blamed the training for not being good enough, and the planes themselves. And finally they realized it was the cockpit. The cockpit was just too cramped for the pilots. And so the Army recruited some researchers out of Wright Air Force Base in Ohio, thinking that the pilot had grown since the 1920s. They wanted to calculate a new average. And one of the members of the team was a guy named Gilbert Daniels. And Gilbert Daniels was this young 23-year-old researcher from Harvard University. And he was interested in figuring out, well, what is the important dimensions of this? And he came up with 10 dimensions that a pilot needed in order to be able to operate the cockpit well. Their height and their shoulder width and their arm length and a variety of other things. And the Army sent him off to figure out, or the Air Force sent him off to figure out, well, what are the ideal dimensions for that? And the dimensions that they came up with were this set of averages based on 4,000 pilots. And they figured out what the specific center ideal pilot dimension would be. But Gilbert took the research just a little further, and he asked the question, how many pilots meet those averages? So he went out and he looked at all the data, and he looked at all these 4,000 pilots and found that not one of them was average. Not a single one of them met the averages for these 10 different dimensions of this data. There is no average pilot. There is no average anybody. This idea of an average is a myth. Now let's fast forward again to just last year, when NASA proudly scheduled a spacewalk for the women crew members of the space station. This was the first time there had been multiple women crew members on board, and so they'd scheduled this two-woman spacewalk. But they ran into a problem. It turns out that the EVA suits, the suits that the space suits that the astronauts use, they were not fitted for women. They were created for men. This notion of an average male astronaut, and as a result, they didn't fit. And because they didn't fit, they didn't have enough of them. They had one spacesuit which had been retrofitted to be a medium-sized suit, and they couldn't get two of them, and that was a problem. They could not do, and they had to actually cancel their scheduled historic spacewalk because they didn't have what they needed to fit the people on the space station. And this is an indicator of sort of where we're at today. We don't realize that this basic concept, this designing for the average, has been getting us into trouble now for decades. And if we want to shift the conversation to people with disabilities, just the idea of disabilities is sort of measured on this notion of average. When we think about accommodation, accommodation is always about pushing people towards this ideal notion of who we are. You know, we decide that we need to create technology accommodation so that blind people can see, as it were, and that deaf people can hear, and that people who are mobility impaired can move in some notion that approaches this idea of what a normal person, of what an average person should be able to do. And the outcome of this is that we've been treating people who are disabled as if they're somehow sick, somehow have a medical issue that needs to be corrected. And this is counter to how we should be designing, to how we should be thinking about solving this problem. And the reason that it's counter to this is that this notion of accommodation, well, actually we do it all the time, right? I'm sitting here wearing glasses. In fact, I have two on my desk. This pair, if I wear this pair right now, it will actually give me a headache because it's not adjusted for the focal length of my screen. So I have this second pair to accommodate the problem that the first pair creates. And all of us have these notions of accommodation. I'm sitting in a chair that's adjustable to height. I've got light switches with dimmers that allow me to make the light as bright or as dark as I want. In my car, I can adjust the seat, I can adjust the seatbelt. There are all these factors that we use. And we're not saying that we have to conform to an average. We have to meet that. What we're doing is we're creating a world where everything is adjustable to where we are, not requiring that we fit some basic norm, that we fit some basic middle ground. And this type of accommodation is a shift in thinking in a lot of the world of design, that we don't need to make people be something that they're not. We need to meet people where they are at. We need to be designing for not an individual, but for the universal sum of everybody. This is the centerpiece of what we call inclusive design. It's this idea that we're going to design for the universe of solutions and be designing for everyone. And so we have to start asking ourselves, right? What does that mean? Right? Making something compliant for disability standards is not designing for that universal notion. It's not saying, well, what is it that would make a great experience for everybody? And we're seeing this sort of pushed to its edges right now during this pandemic that we're in. Many people are being asked to work from home, but their homes were not designed to be a great workplace. And so they now have to scramble around and accommodate for this. Uh, it is the case that they don't get to work at their fullest, not because they're somehow disabled in a medical notion of disability, but because they have some issue that is preventing them from being able to be attentive. Maybe it's that they just got a food delivery and they had to tend to that, so they have to leave the meeting, or a child walks in, or there's street noise, or they don't have the bandwidth necessary to have a video conference. And these are the same problems that we have when we start to say, well, how would someone whose vision isn't meeting this notion of an average vision, how would we accommodate that, right? But we don't treat it the same way. This duplicity of treating things for the abled bodies, the able people, in a different way, and treating accommodation for them in a different way than we treat accommodation for folks who have been considered disabled by some notion, is actually really problematic. And so we need to think about this. And to some extent, this happens almost organically. For example, take captioning. Captioning was originally created for people who, for whatever reason, could not hear what was going on. However, captioning turns out to be really useful when you're trying to watch TV in a very noisy environment. It's very useful when English is not your first language, or the people on the television are speaking with an accent that you don't completely understand. Captioning turns out to be this really powerful tool that is not for the audience of disabled people, this classification that we've created. It's for everybody. It's universal. And that's this idea of universal design, is this notion that we want to look at those dimensions and say, where can we meet people where they're at and apply our technological brilliance to giving them the ability to participate like everyone else, not in terms of this norm, and working from there. There's another piece here, which is when we talk about disability, we often first turn to blindness. Then there's often some discussion about hearing. Then maybe if we have a broad enough conversation, we'll talk about some sort of mobility challenges. We often don't talk about mental conditions, things like brain trauma, recent concussions, things like that, being able to operate something while having a migraine. But these are similar in terms of needing some sort of accommodation, but we tend not to think of them as standard disabilities. But if we want to go further, there are other things that could use some accommodation too, that are never considered as this. So for example, we now have a problem with schools trying to operate out of the students' houses that there are students, and in some cases teachers, that actually can't afford to have high-speed bandwidth, and participating in a conference call becomes really problematic. There are conditions that involve uh, uh, people who are being asked now to use technology where they have to reveal uh, personal information about themselves, but don't want to reveal that information because of some situation. Like, for example, they may have been brought into the US as a very small child from another country without the proper immigration process, lived their whole life here, but now they are considered to be an undocumented resident. And as a result, documenting is problematic. Might say, well, okay, they don't deserve to be here, but they're contributing to society. They are part of what we're doing, and in fact, uh, this is key. But now, for example, for them to get the same unemployment or medical benefits, they have to reveal themselves. And in the process of revealing themselves, they may actually subject themselves to potential deportation to a country they've actually never been to or haven't been to since they were very young. And all of this requires some sort of consideration, some sort of accommodation. And so we're now in this situation in the design world where we have to sort of ask ourselves, how do we look at the full spectrum of who a person is? And how do we bring them into our design process in such a way that we can make sure we are designing to allow them to be the best at what they can be? If we're looking for them to be productive employees, how do we do that? If we want them to be participating in our schools, how do we give them the abilities to do that? And how can we do that not by trying to get them to fit some notion of average, but to get them to actually be who they are and have our ability to meet them for what they can bring based on who they are. And so that's where the field of universal design is come about. And at our school in Chattanooga at Center, this is what we're teaching our students. We actually don't have a course on accessibility because we don't see accessibility as being a separate aspect, something that is detached from everything else that they learn. From the moment they show up to the program through the 2 years that they learn to become a user experience designer and are ready to go into an organization and be ready to tackle the challenges, accessibility has been built into every moment, every aspect of the courses, everything from visual design and interaction design, which are courses that teach them how to design the websites and applications and devices that you use every day, to our courses on leadership and our courses on uh, uh, facilitating meetings. The students are taught that they need to think about everybody who is in the audience and everybody that they're designing that experience for. And if they're facilitating a meeting, who's going to be at the meeting? And if they're leading a team, who's on the team? And how do you make this as inclusive a process as possible for everybody involved? So we don't separate it out because we don't want to send the message that accessibility is something you do after the fact. You do all the other things and then you worry about accessibility. Unfortunately, we've dealt with that for far too long. So we are building it into every component of what we do so that the students see the norm is to not think of people who fall away from the average, who fall onto the edge, as being somehow different than the rest of us. All of us are people who have many different dimensions, none of which are average. And all of us need some sort of accommodation at some point in our life. And design is there to give us that flexibility, to allow us to adjust our seat and to put on the right glasses and to do the right thing. And that's what universal design is all about. I'm hoping that as you hear the really smart people who are going to be talking in the rest of this series, you keep that in mind. This is not something we do special. This is not something that we should be doing as an afterthought or as a checkbox item to say, have we considered accessibility? It needs to be part of every discussion. And we need to spend time getting to know every person we're designing for so that we're designing the right things for them the right time. That's what I came to talk to you about. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jared. That was amazing talk. Right now, we're going to go ahead and open up our Q&A. As an attendee, you should be able to see your Q&A panel there on the right side of your screen. If you'd like to ask Jared a question, we're going to be monitoring this Q&A right now. If you feel more comfortable asking a question via a video relay service, we do have someone standing by to field those calls. You can direct that call to 423-298-2489. And hopefully if you have your captions, you will be able to see that number there on the captions in the multimedia viewer. So Jared, we're going to start off right now. One question we've had is, how does race and gender bias play into how we should think about universal design?
Well, I think the example of the spacesuit is a great example of a gender bias, right? Turns out that a lot of things were built with just men in mind, right? If you go by averages, men have larger bodies. So things like crash test dummies, for example, are all based on male anthropomorphic data. And as a result, seat belts and restraining straps actually are not as effective for people with smaller bodies, which would include many, many women. And so as a result, they're just not shaped that way. So there's lots of issues around that. And we're now seeing many issues that are also biased towards race, that as facial recognition becomes part of the technology landscape, a lot of facial recognition systems have been biased for white Caucasian skin, because the training data that they use is mostly pictures of Caucasian. And we're now seeing with the pandemic higher incidences of positive tests and active cases of the virus and even deaths in Black and Hispanic communities. And again, this is not because the disease is somehow more susceptible by those groups, but because the culture that we're in has been designed to allow people who are Caucasian to work from home, whereas a lot of the essential workers fall into those categories and they are more at risk. And so we have to think about how what we're doing is been biased by the people who've been designing. And we have to make sure that we're including not just into our data sets and our testing, but on the teams themselves. We have to include people from a wide spectrum to make sure that everybody's needs are being taken care of and that all the thinking is applied, because any one of us is going to be biased by who we are and our own experiences. We have to be able to step out of that and see the world from other people's perspectives. And that's sort of the nature of empathy. So we need to be way more inclusive in our design process in order to make this happen.
Here's a question from Chad. In your experience, how have you found, what is the best way to engage others in this discussion, especially developers?
The absolute best way to get any developer or stakeholder involved in this type of discussion is to get them exposed to the people who will be using the things that we're designing, right? To actually have them meet with them and not just watch a video or read a survey result, actually go out and spend time with them. We learned a long time ago that the more exposure that uh, team members like developers and stakeholders have with the people who are using it, the more empathy they're able to exercise. You know, there's a thread in the design world these days that we have to teach people empathy, but I don't believe we can teach people empathy. I believe everybody, almost everybody, is born with empathy. There's a group of people who we know aren't born with empathy. Those are sociopaths. We know they don't have empathy because by definition, a sociopath is someone who cannot have empathy. But sociopaths tend to be a smaller part of the community. The larger group means that everybody else has some sort of empathy. But the problem is that we isolate those people uh, from exercising that empathy. We take our devs and we lock them up in their cubicles, and we don't let them out of the building, and we don't let them meet the people who use the things that they're building. And then as a result, we're surprised when the things they build don't work for those people they've never met. So if we really want to have the devs understand who we're designing for, we have to have them meet those people all the time. We have to have exposure. The number that we like to throw around is 2 hours of exposure every 6 weeks. So in the last 6 weeks, if you have a dev who has not spent 2 hours with a real user using it, they're not going to be able to have empathy for the users who are using it. And if we want to make sure that we have a broad community that we're designing for, we have to make sure that when we're introducing and exposing them, we're not just introducing and exposing them to our average customer, we're exposing them to all of our customers, to all of our users, and that we are making sure that they're seeing all the edges of all the dimensions. So if we have a continual process of getting people in front of folks, that's uh, where we need to really focus.
And that's always going to be a prevalent issue with any kind of web development or any kind of design field, is weighing the needs of how do you blend or navigate the balance between the needs of the few versus the needs of, as you called it, the average consumer. That's always something that you have to keep in mind, isn't it?
Yeah, we have to understand what those dimensions are. We have to understand what the edges of those dimensions look like. We have to ask ourselves, how would we design for someone who is deaf? How would we, and has no hearing, how do we design for someone who is uber sensitive to hearing and anything that is slightly loud actually is painful to them? Now, how do we accommodate that full range? And that's just, one dimension. Hearing itself can be broken up into a couple of dimensions, as you know. So we need to understand that full range of all the different ways that people are different from each other. Which means, and the best way to do that is to just meet lots of people who are different from each other. The more we interact from that, the better off we're going to be.
Sure. And I think so. This question from Doug plays off of this quite well. Uh, Maybe the struggle, or just the how difficult it can be sometimes to try to navigate these differences. His question was, as a colorblind male, I find that many sites seem to be off to my eyes. How can we design the color palettes appropriately, knowing that there are several types of color blindness to account for? I mean, this is something as fundamental as the color of your background of your website versus the color of the font, or I mean, could you explain that maybe in a web development standpoint, and then even more broadly?
Yeah, so there's um, oftentimes the color, and Doug can correct me because I am not colorblind. I am unfortunately don't have the privilege of being colorblind, but the uh, oftentimes the issue becomes one of distinguishing differences, right? If you have someone who suffers from a variation of a red-green color blindness, and you have uh, a, uh, a chart that has got a graphic on it, and the graphic has one set of data in red and the other set of data in green, the individual is not going to be able to discern which set of data belongs to which set. So it means that we always have to not just use color, but we need to use shape or some other indicator to make sure that it's clear which is which. But it's not just that. It's that there are actually lots of variations of color blindness, and designing a palette that is useful in all those places is actually quite difficult. But there are things that we can do. There are tools out there that allow us to look at our designs as if we were colorblind. But one of the problems is that those tools have been built separately from the tools we use to create the designs. And what we really need to do is to have the tool vendors build those tools in, and potentially even use technology like machine learning to point out and say, wait a second, those choices that you're making, they may not be distinguishable to everybody who's using this, and could adapt for that. There are other tools that we could create, which would be on the client side. Doug's phone could know that Doug is colorblind, detect the use of colors, and change the color palette to adapt, just like he can change the font. But again, this would require that the operating system vendors and the technology vendors themselves think about this and start to build this in. And this is the problem. We keep treating these things as if they're separate, and we solve them as if they're isolated solutions, and we treat them as a specialty of design, when in fact, this is just how you design. We know not to create fonts that are too small or too big that they don't even fit on the screen. We should know not to have color differentiation that would prevent someone who has a limited color palette from differentiating. So we need to be able to create that type of responsiveness in the technology. And then everything that gets produced to meet those needs. And it's not something that every person needs to consider.
Right.
Uh, just a quick story on this. I have a very good friend who's allergic to onions and garlic. And uh, there is an easy solution to creating things for her, which is don't ever cook with onions and garlic. You remove it from the cupboard. I'm not gonna have an issue of actually making something by accident that's going to create her allergies. So, this is the type of thing we need to understand: is how do we make sure that we're doing it? And again, we already do this, right? You go into restaurants, it's not unusual for them to have a vegetarian dish because they know that there's a group of people who come in who are vegetarian. Now there's many restaurants that offer gluten-free options because they know people come in that way. So there should be options that are onion-free, garlic-free for folks who have those issues. And it's a matter of understanding what those boundaries are. And if we do that everywhere, not just in how we create food, but in all the things we design, we can be much better at it.
Yeah, I love what you said. In my work, so I'm in marketing and I do a lot of graphic design work and web development work. Something that, especially since I've started working for a nonprofit like Signal Centers, working with the disability population, something that has been frustrating, admittedly, to me is, okay, well, this person over here has, for instance, is colorblind or has a certain experience of this thing that I'm creating. Well, eventually, I always thought of it. I think most people probably always thought of it as I have to somehow do a fine, like create something that can accommodate the wide swath, but is of different, whether it's color blindness or somebody's disability. What I love about what you're saying is one area where this is prevalent right now is, and I think, is in languages. So most large websites now have an English version as the default, and then you go up to the top and there's a Spanish translation. Most large websites have that functionality now. And I love what you said about that being kind of not this workaround, but an everyday implementation of, let's not just take into consideration people who don't speak English as a first language, but let's take into consideration someone that might see green and red differently. I love what you said about that, and that's a super like practical way of how we can begin to adapt our design.
Yeah, it is it's a way of thinking, a way of just making it part of how you always, you know, the understanding who these people are and how you're building for them. That's key. The only way to do that really is to spend time with the people you're designing for, and to make sure you make an effort to spend time with the wide swath of all the people you're designing for, not just a very narrow swath of people who meet that notion of our average user.
Hmm. So there's a kind of a more practical, especially from a management perspective, a question from Sarah. So you ask people under you to spend 2 hours every 6 weeks of exposure. How have you found, kind of from a management perspective, the best way to structure that within the workflow of your day?
So if you think about it, if people work a 40-hour week, and I don't know, maybe people still work a 40-hour week, with everything going on at home, it's probably not really happening. But let's say people work a 40-hour week. 6 weeks is 240 hours. So we're talking about 2 hours out of 240. How you structure it can be done any number of ways. You can do it remote over a video conference. Ideally, you would get to a place where you could actually go out and see people in their natural environment doing the things that they're doing with your product or service. If you're designing accommodation for workplaces so that you can have a more inclusive workforce, you're spending time watching people work. If you're designing schools, it's the same sort of thing. It can be 15 minutes chunks. It can be 1 2 hour session sometime in that 240-hour period. But we're talking, 1% of the time, less than 1% of the time. So the idea then is, well, just build it into your work process, right? Make sure that all the time there are visits or interactions with real customers doing real things. Now, if you work in a workplace that's using some sort of agile type development process, this is actually pretty easy. You build it into every sprint. You make it part of the sprint process, where maybe at the beginning of the sprint, you meet with potential users to understand who they are and what they're trying to do. And at the end of the sprint, you're actually bringing the work that you've done in front of them and getting them to interact with it. So that works, and everybody can now have this exposure. But the easiest way to make sure you do this from a management perspective is to track it, to actually count the number of hours you're spending being exposed to folks, and make sure that that's built in. Companies like Intuit actually build it into their performance reviews. You have to spend time with customers in their workplace, watching them interact with your product or a competitor's product, or doing the same thing by hand. They go out and they have tax products and bookkeeping products, and they watch people keep their books or do their taxes. And that's what they do. And they learn amazing things that way. And they learn all about what it means to be uh, inclusive?
Here's another question. This is a good one. In a consumer-oriented world that rewards and prioritizes profit and speed of development, how can we incentivize producers and developers to design with disabilities in mind? Do you see this being widely adopted outside of legislation?
Well, again, I want to go back to this idea that when we start talking about designing with disabilities in mind, we're missing the point, right? We're designing with everyone in mind. And just the framing of that is a really important change. We need to stop saying, well, we covered everybody but the disabilities. Right? When we get into disabilities, we start talking about, well, we're getting it for the 80%. We're not getting it for that last 20%, right? We've made it work for 80% of the people. And this is the way in design we have been thinking for decades, and it's the wrong approach, partially because the products that we're creating now are being used by billions of people. Facebook has more than 2 billion users. 20% of 2 billion is 40 million people. No, 400 million people, right? There are entire countries with less than that size population, right? The United States has less than 400 million people. So would it be okay for Facebook to say, well, we're going to design for everybody except for the United States? That's not how it works. So we need to start thinking about the fact that we can no longer say that disability is just that last mile. We have to be saying, no, we're designing for everybody. And here's the other reality of this. That population is potentially a revenue source. We don't really want to use that as the justification, because there are people who will not be a revenue source who still need access to this. But we want to make it clear that designing for everyone is not an act of charity. Designing for everyone is just what we do. If car manufacturers didn't make seats adjustable, if they didn't make the seatbelt retractable, if the seatbelt was designed for an average waist and the seat was designed for an average leg length, none of us would buy that car. It's because of that adaptability of the vehicle that makes the car a selling point. And every time we create adaptability to adapt to everybody's needs, it becomes a selling point to the product. So we don't want to go down the road of saying, how do we get awareness for designing for disability? We want to say, how do we adapt the product so that more people can use it?
Here's a great question from Betty. Just in your opinion, since the ADA passed in 1990, why do you think it's taken so long for universal accessibility to be addressed?
The ADA is problematic on many different levels. One is that until Robles versus Domino's, it wasn't even considered for the web, and now it's only considered for the web in the 9th District. So it is an issue in that the law itself was passed in such a way that it's easy for an organization to ignore compliance and not participate. And this is why Domino's fought the suit, right? I mean, so if you're not familiar with Robles versus Domino's, it was a suit that was decided last year that actually requires web applications and websites to, in the case of Domino's, the application for ordering a pizza, to be accessible to screen readers. They actually had a web application that did not work, and their argument was, well, we gave you accommodation, you could call and order your pizza that way. And because they had that out, they thought they could get by. But a clever young man decided to push on it, got it all the way up to the Ninth District. In fact, it got taken to the Supreme Court, but the Supreme Court decided that the Ninth District's ruling should stand and decided not to hear the case. So, so the ADA is now starting to waver under this. But the problem is that any accommodation is considered accommodation, even if it's really not accommodation. And that's the problem with that. So what we really need our legislators to do is go back and draft something that is more universal, that actually makes it unacceptable for different modes of interaction to be considered okay. And this is the change that we need. So it's just the law is not effective enough to meet this standard of being really universally adaptable.
Jared, I think that's about all we're going to have time for today. Are there any kind of parting words you'd like to leave with our audience at all?
Well, I think the standard right now is wash your hand and wear your masks. But I think that the key thing is we need to be bringing people into our design teams who are from all different walks of life and are all different edges that we want to expand to. And if we feel like we're missing something, our first move shouldn't be getting exposed to those folks, but our second move should be finding people who could actually be part of the team and be part of the design effort, so that we're always thinking about that and we're always considering it, making sure that we are looking at the full breadth and that we are sort of changing this mindset from thinking of disability as this special case thing that has to be treated with some sort of remedy, and thinking about the fact that everybody is just different. We all have different needs, and then as our life changes, we will all need different things. And as a result, we should design for adaptability and accommodation and be more universal in the design.